Hello, everybody. Good to be with you again tonight. We once again get this opportunity to study God's Word via WOW Live, Word on Wednesdays Live. Hey, just wanted to share a little bit, not real long, but we began doing WOW Live a year ago, April the 22nd of 2020. And here we are, April 21st, 2021. It's been a year, and that's kind of neat. We've only missed handful of evenings for different reasons. I think maybe four, maybe five, but I think it's really around four sessions that we missed the entire year. So that's like 52 weeks in a year. We got like 48 lessons in or something like that. Wouldn't be hard to add it up, I guess, if I counted all the lessons that I've done so far for the three different categories we've been in. At any rate, just wanted to celebrate a little bit, and tonight we're going to talk about, at the beginning anyway, a little bit about philosophy. So hang in there. We're going to talk about mankind being the measure of all things, the times of the Gentiles. This fella kind of represents that from Nebuchadnezzar's vision back in Daniel chapter 2. And so that's kind of where we're at with Daniel's prophecies and so forth. So let's get started with what we have tonight. We are in our 10th lesson of the series, Daniel, the prophet in exile, and we're going to be in Daniel chapter 8 this evening, counting them down now, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Tonight we're going to review a prophetic vision that Daniel saw involving a powerful ram and a very powerful goat, fleet on foot, and not even really touching the ground, according to what Daniel writes. But before we get into the text of Daniel 8 itself, what I want to do is to create, not really create, because I'm not creating anything, but lay out this context for understanding what these prophecies in Daniel's book are really describing for us. What are they telling us about humankind, human history, that sort of thing? Prophecy is history written in advance, after all. Jesus described the world from the time of Nebuchadnezzar until the time of his own return as being the times of the Gentiles, right? This era, from God's viewpoint, is a time of Gentile domination in the city of Jerusalem. All right? It started from Nebuchadnezzar and will go until Jesus returns, which is where these feet represent the last holdout of weakness that the human system, the Gentile system in particular, is doing to the world. From a humanistic viewpoint, this is a time of the growing absence of God in human affairs and human history, at least according to humanist thinking, okay, and the subsequent ascendancy of man. All right? I want us to understand that the character of this age is the idea that man is the measure. Man is the measure of all things. That's the underlying idea of this age. 5 centuries before the time of Christ, in ancient Greece, changes were beginning to happen. The philosopher Socrates, who would be put to death by the state in 399 BC, he was given either that option or complete exile, and he chose death. He was educating young men in Athens at that time, and just a few years prior to Socrates, there was another Greek philosopher by the name of Protagoras. One of the fundamental ideas of Protagoras that survived to our day is this very thing. Man is the measure of all things. Now, in a way, we could call Protagoras' statement here kind of a soundbite. We don't really know the entire context in which this statement was made. Not really sure when he said it or in what particular context, so it becomes difficult to see exactly what Protagoras meant by man is the measure of all things. But it's nonetheless safe to make a generalization that Protagoras viewed mankind as being the very center of the universe. And then all things in the universe revolved around mankind. They were to be viewed from that perspective. Man's the center of all things. Man is the measure of all things. Protagoras said something else that's been handed down through the centuries, and it gives us a little insight into his theology, into his view of God, or in his case, the gods that Greece had, a pantheon of gods which they worshipped, but Protagoras probably didn't. Listen to what he said concerning the gods. I have no means of knowing whether they exist or not, or of what sort they may be, because of the obscurity of the subject and the brevity of human life. I'm not here long enough to figure it out. That's kind of what he's saying. Kind of an honest admission, I guess, but kind of agnostic. He doesn't really know if there's a god or gods or whatever. So since Protagoras summarily rejected this notion of the divine, for him then, man truly was the measure of everything else. In Protagoras' view, we find the very foundations of modern humanistic thinking. The absence of God and the ascendancy of man. The absence of God and the ascendancy of man. This is what so many in our culture and in our day have come to. But this Protagorean viewpoint on the man being the measure of all things, it raises some important questions. If man truly is the measure of all things, well then, what kind of man should be set up as the standard or the ideal man? What are we talking about here? Who is the standard? I mean, we can't, is it Elvis Presley or is it Barney Fife? You know what I'm saying? It's like we can't let everybody be the standard. There's a problem with that, so somebody has to be the one. What kind of a man can set an example for the rest of us? Who will help us to determine what we ought to value in life and how much value we should place upon it? Who's going to answer those questions? And also, what is really important in life? And how do we know that? Who's going to be there to show us right from wrong? Is this all established by some kind of popular vote, as in a democracy? If so, I don't think I was ever asked to vote. I doubt that you have either. Is it more of a monarchy, perhaps, or a dictatorship where the king or the dictator, sets the rules, and maybe the king or the dictator, maybe they are the man that is the measure of all things for the rest of us. We'll all be like the king, Or is it, as Plato would later recommend, leadership by an elite group of philosopher kings who would offer their wise counsel and hand down their laws to the rest of us lowlifes? The ones, an elitist kind of group. They would tell us what to do, like whether we should stay social distance by 6 feet or wear masks wherever we go or things like that, And if so, if that's what happens, well then, who gets to decide who these elite philosopher kings are? Do they decide it for themselves, which is probably the most likely scenario? But are they the best of the best of the best? Are they really good enough for this, or did they just get it because they happen to have the most money, or they had the most power, and somehow they've ascended to the top of the heap by some evolutionary way of thinking, and therefore they deserve to be the ones who are head of all things and whatnot, and everything else? I'm just saying. Are they, how do we know what best really means of the best of the best of the best? Who decides that? Who gets to define that? What scale or standard are we using? You see the problem that kind of emerges here? The problem with this Protagorean notion is, which man is the measure of all things? It's fair to say that the rest of the history of the Greco-Roman civilization, from Protagoras on down, I guess, on up to our modern day, has been the struggle with this very question. Which man is the measure of all things? And people vying for that position, and one country, nation, under an emperor conquering another, and back and forth and ascending up and up. And the Greco-Roman answer proved to be wholly inadequate to any of this question. Okay, in his book, How Should We Then Live? The Rise and Decline of Western Thought and Culture, Francis Schaeffer writes this. He says, in many ways, Rome was great, but it had no real answers to the basic problems that all humanity faces. Much of Roman thought and culture was shaped by Greek thinking, especially after Greece came under Roman rule in 146 BC. The Greeks tried first to build their society upon the city-state, that is, the polis. The city-state, both in theory and fact, was comprised of all those who were accepted as citizens. And see, already I've got questions. Who's doing the accepting? And apparently only certain ones are being allowed into citizenry. There's the haves and the have-nots, the ones vaccinated and the ones not. And I don't know. All values had meaning in reference to the polis. Thus, when Socrates had to choose between death and exile from that which gave him meaning, the polis in other words, he chose death. But the polis failed, since it proved to be an insufficient base upon which to build a society. The Greeks and later the Romans also tried to build their society upon their gods. Well, now maybe they're thinking the right way. It's more transcendent, right? They're beyond us. But actually, these gods, Schaeffer says, were not big enough because they were finite, limited. They had a beginning. They didn't know everything, and they had human failings. Even all their gods, he says, put together were not infinite. Actually, the gods in Greek and Roman thinking were like men and women larger than life, kind of like Superman or Captain America or Iron Man or somebody, but not basically different from human men and women. So the gods were amplified humanity, not divinity. Like the Greeks, the Romans had no infinite God. This being so, they had no sufficient reference point intellectually. That is, they did not have anything big enough or permanent enough to which to relate either their thinking or their living. Consequently, their value system was not strong enough to bear the strains of life, either individual or political. All their gods put together could not give them a sufficient base for life, morals, values, and final decisions. These gods depended on the society which had made them. Oh, the gods are a product of the society, see? It's not beyond the society, transcendent, coming down and addressing things. It's part of the society that made it. And when this society collapsed, well, the gods tumbled with it. Thus, the Greek and Roman experiments in social harmony, which rested on, notice this, an elitist republic, ultimately failed. So if we have a group of elitists doing things now, what's the odds of it succeeding? Not very good. All right, I know you thought that this was going to be a Bible study, not a lecture on Greek philosophers. But in a way, we have been discussing some aspects of this very question about man being the measure of everything throughout. As I pointed out earlier, we've got this guy right here who's representing the times of the Gentiles. Which man is the measure of all things? Is it the Babylonian man, the Medo-Persian man in the silver, the Greek man, the Roman man with the strong iron legs, or the revived Roman system, which is made of clay and iron and stands to collapse once the rock of Jesus strikes it at its very feet. I'm hiding the feet there. Boosh, and just destroys the whole thing. Everything grows to powder and blows away. Which man? All right. We've been talking about this the whole time. Last week we talked about the Antichrist, right? The little horn of Daniel 7. And we saw this little horn, an individual, right, of great power rising up out of the 10 horns, right? And he speaks blasphemous things. He'll be the perhaps ultimate measure of all things human, the man that everybody wants to follow, who was able to make war with the beast, it says in Revelation 13. Remember that all of these events are set in the context of what Jesus calls the times of the Gentiles. And here's that passage from Luke 21. He's talking to his disciples. But when you see Jerusalem, he says, which is behind him there in the picture, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, that would be Gentile armies because they're not Jewish, then know, he says, that Jerusalem's desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea, in the region around Jerusalem, get out of here, flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her, depart. Get out of the city, get out of town, get out of the area. And let not those who are in the country enter her. Don't go back into the city for anything. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. So he's talking about a kind of judgment here. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. And they will fall, by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. Nations, Gentile nations, okay? And Jerusalem, he says, will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now, the Gentiles are the non-Jewish peoples of the world. The times of the Gentiles began when Nebuchadnezzar captured the Jewish capital of Jerusalem and destroyed the temple built by Solomon. The times of the Gentiles will end when Christ returns and sets his foot upon the Mount of Olives, probably where Nebuchadnezzar himself had once stood, watching his army take Jerusalem and trample it underfoot. During this Gentile period of history, a godless philosophy will often be the rule of the day. You see, the dominant philosophy in a society is very important, because whatever that society holds to be the right way of looking at things, the dominant philosophy in a society is very important because it determines how the people in that society view the world around them. How do they view things? What do they value? And so forth. History happens because people make choices, and people make choices based upon what they think is important, based on what they value. And their set of values is based upon what they believe to be true, their philosophy. And so the kind of philosophy a people holds, the way they view the world, that has tremendous impact on what they do, and it carries out into history. But one thing that arises with all of this is the need to somehow embody this philosophy. Intangible thoughts and ideas, no matter how lofty or how true or whatever they may be, they need to become real for people. How does this impact my life? All right? You can talk about good ideas all the time, but what's it in for me? How's it going to impact my life? These ideas need to be tangible somehow. They need to be, you have to be able to grasp them literally and live them out, personal even. There is this strong need to have, therefore, a person who represents the ideals of the people. So when a philosophy says that man is the measure of all things, well, there needs to be a man in whom those principles the people hold become manifest. Who's going to show these things for us? There needs to be a particular man who represents the measure of all things. And see, I think that is how we are designed, to long to touch that in which we believe. The object of our faith is an object. It's objective, right? For example, in Jesus, we are told that the Word of God became flesh and dwelt among us. God himself came in the flesh. Tangible, touchable. God has communicated himself to us, not just through the Bible, but mostly through the work and the person of Jesus Christ here on earth. The Bible points us back to Jesus. He is God's Word, God's spoken word, his thoughts and ideas made manifest to all men. In a way, when we take communion at church, we are tangibly holding what represents the incarnation, God being in the flesh. Jesus says, do this to remember me and my physical presence among you. And it's a tangible, though symbolic means of doing so. We touch the bread, and we bring the cup to our lips, and we touch the fluid with the wine with our lips. And I don't believe, as some do, that the bread and wine actually become the body and blood of the Lord. But I tell you, with that deeply felt need to touch his reality, I can almost understand why some might want to believe that that is what happens. Think of Thomas in the Bible. Chapter 20 of John, verses 24 and 25. Now Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, we have seen the Lord. And so he said to them, well, unless I see his hands, in his hands, the print of those nails that were very, very real, and I put my finger into the print of those nails, if I can touch this, and I can put my hand into his side, unless I get to do that, I will not believe. We often call Thomas Doubting Thomas in a kind of derogatory fashion, as though, had we been there, well, we would not have been like him. Oh, no, not us. We would take by faith the word of the other disciples when they said they had seen the risen Lord. You know, I don't fault Thomas here, not in one bit. His response is human. I can identify with that. He had that need to touch and to see for himself. He wanted that intangible made tangible. We are called to believe by faith. We are longing for faith to be sight. Jesus said, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe, and then we fall in that category. But we are longing for that faith to be sight. Something goes wrong in life, and the first thing we say is, God, where are you? God, where are you? We want to touch him, see. We long for his touch. You remember this account? Now a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years, and had suffered many things from many physicians. She had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well. And immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus immediately, knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? The longing to touch. Jesus is the divine made real. He is the God-man. He is called the theanthropic person, God made flesh, dwelling in our midst. If any man is the measure of all things, it is the God-man, the Lord Jesus Christ. And the need for touching the divine, that's a strong, powerful need. That's why when people abandoned belief in the true God and they sought out false gods, they made images of them. We think of that great image in the vision of Nebuchadnezzar, that very human-looking image. Man is the measure of all there is. An image formed with human hands, touched, handled. Recall, too, that the rock, which came to destroy this man-made image, representing the times of the Gentiles, is described in the Bible as a stone not cut with hands. It's not handled by human hands. This is not a graven image. It comes from outside of us, unlike those Greek gods, which did not. Even if people abandon God, the one and only living and true God, they will still need the tangible. And so it's not surprising at all that Satan will offer up a man as a god, the Antichrist, Satan's ultimate attempt to manifest his antithesis to God's plan for the ages, his own evil and twisted lying words made flesh. He offers up his own God to be worshipped and adored. This is the man who is the measure of all things. In truth, the whole history of man on earth in his rebellion against God as creator and Lord of all is the very desire to set himself up as a god. If you eat of this tree, you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And if you combine that concept with a similar notion for the rebellion of Lucifer and the other fallen spiritual beings, angels and so forth, well, you have all of the underpinnings then, and you have all of the makings of every single one of the false belief systems and philosophies and all the ideologies of history. It's at the root of all of that. See, we want to solve our problems on our own. The humanists have articulated this creed. No deity will save us. We must save ourselves. The absence of God, the ascendancy of man. Paul-Henri Spaak was a Belgian politician and statesman. In the mid-20th century, right after World War II, Spaak was one of the key leaders pushing for European unity. He was instrumental in seeing to it that Brussels, Belgium, became the central city for the European Union. And Spaak once said, "We don't want another committee. We have too many committees already. What we want is a man. Man is the measure of all things." This is the 1950s, right? What we want is a man of sufficient stature to hold the allegiance of all people and to lift us out of the economic morass in which we are sinking. Send us such a man, and be he God or the devil, we will receive him. Wow. The search for the ideal man. The man who will be the measure of all things, the central figure that others can and will follow. Be he God or be he a devil, that man will be the measure of all things that we want. So then, we finally come to Daniel chapter 8. Daniel has this vision. Chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time, which would have been from Daniel chapter 7. He says, I saw in the vision, and it so happened while I was looking that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Now in this vision, Daniel sees that he is in a place called Shushan. Not Shushan, okay, Shushan. Where in the world is Shushan? Well, Shushan is a Babylonian word, probably referring to the lilies that proliferated in that region. Shushan was also known to the Greeks as Susa, S-U-S-A. Susa was a chief city of the Medo-Persian realm. On the map there, kind of on the border of the purple and green area, you'll see Susa inside that yellow star that I put on the map. It was about 250 miles east of Babylon. Susa was located in the province of Elam and was just north of the body of water that we know of as the Persian Gulf, and you can see that down there. The overall thing here is a map of the Medo-Persian Empire at its peak. Okay, that's what all the colored areas are combined. Different areas are different times. You can sort of see that in what you can see of the legend up there. Anyway, it's the city where about a century after Daniel's time, Esther would be living as queen to King Artaxerxes. Okay, so Shushan sat on the bank of the river Ulai, which was known to the Greeks as the Coaspes River. The valley was very fertile there, a river valley. The vision that Daniel sees has great importance, as he is later told in verse 17 of Daniel 8. So this one who was talking to him came near where I stood, and when he came I was afraid, and I fell on my face. But he said to me, "Understand, Son of Man, that the vision refers to the time of the end." So it's very important. The vision that Daniel sees refers to the time of the end. So what happens in this vision? We should take a look at it. Daniel chapter 8, verses 3 and 4. Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram, which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand. But he did according to his will, and became great. So Daniel sees a ram, a male sheep, standing by the river Ulai, where he's at. The ram has 2 horns that are high, meaning that they are very long. But one of the horns is longer than the other. And Daniel says that the longer one came up last. Somehow, he could tell that the shorter horn was first to form on the ram's head, and then the second longer horn grew out. Remember, we said that the horns represent power. Okay? Now, Daniel is going to be given some help in coming to understand this vision. And the way I've laid this out is we look at a little bit of the vision, and then we look at the explanation towards the end of the chapter, rather than reading it all in succession. So later on in chapter 8, then, we read this in verses 15 through 17. Then it happened, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, and was seeking the meaning of the vision, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, who called and said, "Gabriel, make this man understand the vision." So this voice comes somewhere out of the river, I guess, between the banks, puts him in the middle of the river. But this voice comes and says, we don't see a man there, but we hear this voice, "Make this man understand the vision." And so he came near where I stood, and when he came I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, "Understand, Son of Man, that the vision refers to the time of the end." So this is Gabriel, all right? The angel Gabriel, the same one who came to Mary and also to Zacharias in the opening chapter of the Gospel of Luke. Gabriel is told to help Daniel to understand the meaning of this vision. So Gabriel continues, verses 18 to 20. Now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and stood me upright, and he said, "Look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation. For at the appointed time the end shall be. The ram which you saw, having the 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia." So, the horns represent Media and Persia. This 2-horned ram represents the Medo-Persian Empire. The longer one came up last. That would be the Persian, okay? And the horn that came up first was the Medes. They were there first. And then Persia came and conquered them. Recall the 2 silver arms of the image of Daniel 2. Medo-Persian Empire with two arms, right? And the bear that had one side higher than the other from Daniel chapter 7. The longer horn of Persia on this ram is the more powerful nation of the two-horned alliance, the Persians. The ram pushes west, north, and south, and no one can stand in his way. This is the conquering of land that Medo-Persia does. Obviously, this refers to the dominance of the Medes and the Persians for a time. Remember that at the time Daniel wrote this, the Babylonians were still in charge. Belshazzar was there. It was going to end soon, but for that time, anyhow, it was still Babylonians. But the Medo-Persian Empire was yet future. So all this is prophetic from his standpoint. The vision continues. As I was considering, this is back to verse 5 now, back in the beginning of the chapter, and as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west, across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. Told you this thing was fast. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Daniel's absorbed in seeing how the ram is dominant when suddenly, coming so rapidly his feet don't even touch the ground, this male goat is hurtling in on the scene from the west. The goat has a single horn right between the eyes. Later, Gabriel explains to Daniel, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that's between its eyes is the first king, which would be Alexander the Great, as history has told us. This horn of power, Alexander the Great, coming from the west with his great army of 35,000 Greeks. And the goat then attacks the two-horned ram. Then he came to the ram that had the two horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. There was no stopping or reconsidering or wondering whether he could take the ram on. He just rammed the ram, okay? And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his two horns. There was now no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. All right, the male goat with one prominent horn dominates, defeats the two-horned ram. The goat attacks with an enraged fury. The ram doesn't have any power to stand up against him. Two horns are broken, symbolizing his loss of power, and the goat tramples the ram to the ground. There's no help, no hope for the ram. Now, Alexander did indeed lead his army on a tremendously rapid campaign of continual conquest. 11 years. Look at all that land. From over in Macedonia, not the church where we're at, but of course that brown area in the far left of that map, all the way, everything you see in color, 11 years. 11 years he took it. Started in his early 20s. He died when he was 33. But the speed with which he accomplished this is symbolized by that goat running so rapidly that its hooves don't even touch the ground. Remember when we were looking at the Daniel chapter 7, Greece was represented by the leopard with 4 heads and wings, not touching the ground, and leopards are fast too. Alexander went forth conquering and to conquer, okay? Josephus, the 1st century A.D. Jewish historian, right a little bit after the time of Jesus and the apostles, gives an account of Alexander the Great as he came up against Jerusalem in 332 B.C. And this is interesting. Meanwhile, Alexander had conquered Tyre. Okay, Tyre was on the western coast, the Mediterranean coast, near where Israel was at, following a 7-month siege. That's an interesting story in and of itself, how the Greeks built from the rubble from the previous attack against Tyre. They had moved out to an island and rebuilt Tyre. But the rubble that had been from the destroyed city from centuries before, the Greeks used to build a land bridge out to the island where they thought they were safe, and they took them. Okay, anyway, after 2 more months, he had taken the city of Gaza also. And then he hurried, notice the hurrying, to go up to Jerusalem. Now, when Jaddua, the high priest, heard that Alexander was coming, he was terrified. and he ordered his people to join him in sacrifice and prayer to God. Appearing to him in a dream, God told him to take courage and decorate the city with wreaths. The people were to clothe themselves in white, and priests with the robes of their order. We're going to have a party, a celebration. The Greeks have come, And then they were to march out of the gates to meet the Macedonians, for they would not be harmed. Jaddua awoke rejoicing and announced the revelation to all. When he learned that Alexander was not far from the city, he went out in procession with the priests and the people. Alexander saw the procession coming toward him. The priests were clothed in linen, and the high priest in a robe of blue and gold. On his head was a mitre, a tall hat kind of thing, with the golden plate on which God's name was inscribed. Approaching alone, look at this, Alexander prostrated himself before the name of God and greeted the high priest, Yahweh, right? As the Jews welcomed Alexander with one voice, and encircled him, his officers wondered if he had suddenly become insane. Oh, great. One of them, Parmenio, went up to Alexander and asked him to explain. And he replied, "When I was at Dium in Macedonia, considering how I could become master of Asia, I saw this very person in my sleep, dressed just as he is now. And he urged me not to delay, but to cross over confidently and take dominion over the Persians." Well, that's who we're talking about right now. Alexander was escorted into Jerusalem by the high priest and his attendants. He went up into the temple where he sacrificed to God according to the high priest's directions. And when the book of Daniel was shown to him, which predicted that one of the Greeks would destroy the Persian Empire, where we've been reading tonight, he thought himself to be the one so designated. Guess what, Alexander? We think so too. When he offered the Jews whatever they desired, the high priest asked that they might observe their own laws and be exempt from the tribute of every 7th year. And Alexander granted these requests. And they further asked that the Jews in Babylon and Media, be allowed their own laws, and he also agreed to that. That's just fascinating reading to me. Notice Alexander had this vision after the Jewish high priest had a dream. Alexander had this sense of being deity, of being divinely appointed. And in some ways, as we consider how the Lord raises up kings and he brings them down, he was. Alexander was tutored under Aristotle, the Greek philosopher who had himself been a student of Plato. Plato had been a student under Socrates. And Alexander had been thoroughly immersed in this concept, this Greek doctrine of the ideal man, And he came to see himself as the embodiment of that ideal. Man is the measure of all things. I tell you, this is a critical idea in human history. Daniel 8 and verse 8. "Therefore, the male goat grew very great." That's who we were just talking about, But when he became strong, the large horn was broken. So once he conquered a great empire and had set it up, he didn't have time to enjoy it. He died. In place of it, 4 notable ones came up and took toward the 4 winds of heaven. The male goat reaches his peak of power, and just at that moment the single horn breaks, and in its place 4 horns rise up in power, like you can kind of see on that. And they're represented by the 4 winds, or the 4 points of the compass, north, east, south, and west. Gabriel later explains in verse 22 of Daniel 8, "As for the broken horn, and the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that one nation, but not with its power." Alexander was still in his prime when he died. At age 33, he had a night of drunken revelry, which made him susceptible to the flu virus that eventually killed him. Man, if he had social distance and had a mask, but anyway. His kingdom was divided up between 4 of his generals. The 4 notable ones prophesied in Daniel 8. Ptolemy ruled in Egypt to the south. The northern portion was ruled by Seleucus. Lysimachus ruled Thrace in the northwest, and the far west, Macedonia, was under control of Cassander. They indeed did not have near the power of Alexander the Great. And then verse 9, this prophecy of Daniel 8 goes on to say, "And out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land." Out of one of the four horns, another little horn arises. It grows toward the south and to the east, and also toward the glorious land. Well, the glorious land would be Israel, Daniel's homeland. Let's read verses 10 and 12 about this little horn. "And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host, and some of the stars to the ground, and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of God's sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army," get up here. "Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered." Gabriel later explains to Daniel about this little horn, verses 23 to 25 of Daniel chapter 8. I've got 9 here on the reference. I messed up there, but it's chapter 8 actually. "And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully, and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty, and also the holy people." That's the Jews. "Through his cunning, he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means." So what is it that this little horn is going to do? J. Vernon McGee explains. The little horn of this chapter, he says, is not the same little horn as described in the previous chapter, meaning, of course, Daniel chapter 7. There, the little horn arises out of the fourth kingdom, Rome, right? Here, the little horn comes out of the third kingdom, Greece. This little horn is historical, meaning it's in the past, while the little horn of chapter 7 is to be revealed in the end times, in the future. The little horn being presently considered here in chapter 8 came out of Syria from the Seleucid dynasty. And he was, and here's a historical figure that actually this horn represented, he was Antiochus IV, or Epiphanes, the son of Antiochus the Great. He's sometimes called Epiphanes the Madman. He was another demented ruler. Antiochus came to the throne in 175 BC, and he made an attack on Jerusalem. It was against him that the Maccabees were raised up in Judah. This was a work of God in and of itself. Anti-Semitic to the core, he tried to exterminate the Jews. He placed an image of Jupiter in the holy place in the temple of Jerusalem. Remember that, okay? Keep that in mind, this placing of Jupiter in the holy place. Because here's what McGee says. He says, this was the first abomination of desolation. And then he also poured swine broth over all the holy vessels. Now, while the little horn of Daniel 8 is not the exact same little horn of Daniel 7, who is of course the coming Antichrist, certainly we can say that there is a definite connection between these two little horns. That a little horn would be the symbolism to describe both rulers, I believe, suggests there is a relationship. They're not the same, but they're related. And I would suggest to you that Antiochus Epiphanes of 175 BC is a historical type of the Antichrist yet to come. his anti-Semitic behavior, his persecution, his profaning of the temple by putting an image of Jupiter in the holy place, these are certainly all characteristic of the evil ruler to come. Note that McGee says Antiochus' desecration of the temple was the first abomination of desolation. The Antichrist will one day place an image of himself in the holy place of the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. And that will be the abomination of the desolation spoken by Jesus, where Jesus tells them much the same thing as he did in Luke 21 that we saw earlier, where he tells everyone, when you see this happen, this abomination of desolation, get out of town. Here he says, in verses 15 and 16, therefore when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, that's the temple, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Here, Jesus is referring to the statement of Daniel in chapter 9. And the next time we get together, we will turn to look at Daniel 9. I have a feeling that's going to take maybe a couple weeks to really grasp everything happening in that prophecy. The Greek philosopher Protagoras once said, man is the measure of all things. But the question immediately arises, as we saw, which man? Which man is the measure of all things? Trained by the famous philosopher Aristotle, Alexander the Great saw himself as the ideal man of which the Greek philosopher spoke. But he only lived 33 years, and his kingdom that he built in 11 of those years fell into 4 pieces after his death. Out of one of those 4, Antiochus Epiphanes became a type of the evil ruler that would be Satan's ideal man, persecuting and hoping to destroy the chosen nation of God, trying to prevent the coming of that seed of the woman who would destroy Satan, blaspheming the temple of God in Jerusalem, setting up an idolatrous image of Jupiter in the Holy of Holies, the first abomination of desolation. But he didn't last. The man serving as the ultimate measure of all things evil will be the coming Antichrist. The point of all this is this: if man is the measure of all things, well then God has been excluded from consideration. Therefore, by definition, such a measure, whatever it might be, is, at the very root of it, godless. By definition, then, such a measure must be evil. And the ultimate evil man will be the beast of Revelation 13, the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians 2, and the little horn of Daniel 7. And also, he's known as the prince who is to come, as described in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27. And we'll begin studying that prophecy in earnest starting next week. Thank you so much for being with me tonight. Thank you for being with me throughout the year past. And let's go into the year ahead as we continue to look at what God is doing through this prophecy he's given, history written in advance. Have a blessed week. Serve him wherever you go. Take care.